holy assembly, and on the seventh day a holy assembly. No work shall be done on those days, but what everyone needs to eat, that alone may be prepared by you, and you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread. For on this very day I brought your host out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a statute forever. So um, one question I thought was, what is the first day and seventh day? Um, I guess to us, maybe when we think about it, it's Sunday and Saturday. Seeing how it sounds like these days are like the Sabbath, worshiping on the first day of the week could sound like a Sunday and does make sense. And then, well, in this section is, how did they tell what was the first day and what was the seventh day? And I looked into the background on that, and I'm gonna elaborate more on the calendar in the next couple slides. But you know, to me, one of the biggest things is I have a few friends that became 7-day Adventists, and they would always argue with me, why do you guys worship on Sunday? You should be worshiping on Saturday. And I kind of like this verse where it says, you know, you're gonna set apart the Sunday and Saturday, and then later on we know that Jesus says, and even Paul says that, you know, every day is a good day to worship. And so in this situation, you kind of get the institution of, you know, worshiping being set apart, and it sounds like, you know, it's a Sabbath from what we get during the Ten Commandments later on in Exodus. What is a holy assembly? So Durham translates worship, and so obviously now, you know, when you hear worship, you think more of coming together, praising the Lord, in their sense, to probably giving sacrifice and offerings to the Lord for forgiveness of sins. I looked up the word assembly. I didn't really put that in detail, and congregation. Later on, they're going to use the term congregation of Israel, and there are 4 different words that they use. It shows up 139 times in the Old Testament, and congregation and assembly is you know, interchangeable in those texts. And I kind of, you know, that it's interesting because congregation, yeah, by itself, it just sounds like a group of people, and so the congregation of Israel is just a group of people, and the group of people. But when you say assembly, and the way that they're using it here, it says holy assembly, or means, you know, it feels like that, you know, they are set apart to worship the Lord. Israel is set apart as a congregation or a group of people to worship the Lord, and therefore God told Moses to tell the people that they will set apart 2 days to worship the Lord. And you know, during this this period of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is a 7-day period, they will only eat unleavened bread. Verse 17, the festival of unleavened bread, therefore, you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a statute forever. Durham states that the purpose of this festival is to remind the Israelites that through the 10th plague, which allows them to make an exodus. And so that's the purpose of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, is basically a festival to remind them of the struggles and what God has done for them because of the situation. And at this point, it still leaves me to question what, you know, why unleavened bread. You know, this is before the 10th plague, and this is right before the actual Exodus. And Durham, you know, basically lets us know that it's reminders, but like why? It kind of still begs a question of, you know, why did God already set this in place prior to the events happening? And that's why I think that this is the overall question of this section that a lot of young people ask during Bible studies. If you could turn to the next slide, please. In the first month, from the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. For 7 days no leaven is to be found in your house. If anyone eats what is leavened, that person will be cut off from the congregation of Israel. whether he is a sojourner or a native of the land. You shall eat nothing leavened in all your dwelling places. You shall eat unleavened bread. So verse 18, what is the first month and how is this determined? I use Logos, and in Logos, the Holman Illustrated Bible Dictionary, the Old Testament indicates days and months. However, it never prescribes a structure how, how the system of months and days and weeks are established. However, it is known that the ancient people could map out the year, and they knew that there was 365 days a year. But depending on who was influencing the Jews, that's probably how they established their calendar. Most likely, it was modeled after the Canaanites. If you could turn to the next slide for me, real quick. So this is basically a chart explaining how the years was broken down. So it's used. The year could be broken down through agriculture and the harvesting. That's what most likely the Canaanites used to determine their year. And obviously, we know that the Mesopotamians and the Romans, they had a different way of determining the year. They used spring as a way to, because spring represented new life. And so they thought that was a great way to start off a year celebrating new life. And so if you notice here in the blue circle, that's the Jewish names for the Hebrew names of the lunar months. And the lunar months is they took that from the Canaanites because they used the lunar calendar, and that began with the year with agriculture. So stating that that depending on when they harvest. But one thing that caught my attention was this chart only has 10 sections. This blue area only has 10 sections, and it shows that the time span of 2 months, they could give or take the way that the year was going. They had different names for it. If you notice on the two ends of the circle, there's two sections that don't have a separation between them, and they have two different names, and that's an overlap of the time of year where, depending on the situation of the harvest or the of what the weather was like, they kind of established that. So it's kind of like, I guess, in equivalence to us, when even though we say that it's supposed to be spring, but it still feels like winter, they kind of had these overlapping names for that situation. Real quick, Professor?
Yeah, Joseph, most of the time we can hear you, but then sometimes there's a little noise and then there's nothing and then you come back on again. So I don't know if you're, bumping against your cord or something. If you can just keep that in mind, maybe.
Okay. Can you turn back to the last slide for me real quick? So verse 19 through 20 is the rules of the festivals in relations to unleavened bread. So we know that if anybody who eats of leavened bread or has leavened bread in their home or their dwelling place, then they will be cut off from the congregation of Israel. And like I said earlier, congregation of Israel, the word congregation kind of interchanged with the word assembly, and with the way the Durham's translated it, he said more of like a holy worship, a holy assembly. And so it kind of gives off that, that chosen people feeling and the importance of being part of the chosen people of Israel. And it also indicates here that even sojourners or natives of the land, regardless of if they are either or, they will still get cut off. And I found that really interesting, and that will be further elaborated on the sojourners who partake in the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. So if you could turn the next two slides for me. Okay. So right here, verse 21 to 23 is just a breakdown of the actual Passover. Durham points out that they are supposed to do this by clan and not by amount of people that can consume a lamb. So I thought it was pretty interesting. Called all the elders of Israel and said to them, Go and select lambs for yourselves according to your clans, and kill the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of the hyssop and dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and touch the lintel and the two doorposts with the blood that is in the basin. None of you shall go out of the door of his house until the morning, for the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians. And when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, the Lord will pass over the will not allow the destroyer to enter your houses to strike you. Yeah, kind of like the cross. But when I read this section, it always brings me back to that old movie, The Ten Commandments. And I don't know if any of you guys saw that, but there was a scene where one of the Egyptians, he took blood and he threw it on the lintel and the two doorposts of his house and his friend's house. And but after reading this text, it kind of says, well, does that even work, for him? And I don't know if there's an answer to this, really. I don't know what you guys might think, but it was a question that kind of came to mind, because if you were supposed to choose a Passover lamb, and that lamb is specifically set to your clan or your household, so what if an Egyptian took a Passover, took a lamb, and then he slit its throat and let the blood go drip into the basin, and then he used the hyssop to cover the mark his door? Will he be spared? And that's a question that kind of really made me think, because right now we know that the Israelites are the chosen people. How does that fare if an Egyptian came to faith of the Hebrew people they were living with? Yeah, there were at the end of the Exodus, it's going to indicate later that there are Egyptians that joined the Israelites during the Exodus, and yeah, that's something that's going to be pointed out next. Slide, please, Professor. Verse 24, you shall observe this rite as a statute for you and your sons forever. Observe this forever. Is this another reason why the Jews today still don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah? Because if they're supposed to observe this forever, and Jesus came and he said that he's going to make a new covenant with the Last Supper that he does that mean that they're no longer observing this rite or this ritual or this Passover? Because now for us it has a totally different meaning. And so that's another thing that makes me question, because is this something that makes the Jewish people falter in their understanding and their beliefs, saying that, well, God told us to do the Passover for forever and generations, but now Jesus says that the Passover has a different meaning, and it's no longer the same meaning that we held value to back in the day. And so that's something that I kind of wish I had an opportunity to explore, but I did not find an answer for that. So moving on to verse 25. Did
Joseph,
observe the Passover?
Sure, just because of we can take care of this quickly. So the Old Testament, the Hebrew word olam, that is usually translated forever, actually means essentially a long time. So it can be forever and ever, but because it means basically a long time, it's not problematic in relationship to the Passover.
Okay, cool. That's awesome that there's an answer to that. So verse 25, did they observe the Passover while wandering in the desert? I mean, obviously we know that they were able to, because manna fell from the sky, and God provided meat for birds for them to eat. And so I don't see why they couldn't observe the Passover during that. But I know that in the text, and when you come to the land that the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall keep this service. So, but then again, that kind of begs the question. Obviously, we understand that they're able to, but did they keep this while they were wandering for 40 years in the desert? So, and obviously Professor Escherbach just answered that. Moving on to verse 26 and 27, Durham states that the Passover was repeatedly done yearly so that the children can relive the experience. It is not just a form to pass on information, but the repetition will remind the generations to come of the hardship. The commitment to continually do this is of free will and not under slavery. I mean, that really stood out and kind of gave me the understanding of why they're continuing to do this Passover. And this also is another reason why they do unleavened bread. But that's going to be more elaborated on in the next section of the text. So if you could turn to the next slide, please. So at midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn. So this is beginning at verse 29. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive, who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians. And there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. I know that Durham actually speaks about this a little bit, where he kind of emphasizes on the importance of who were the people that were affected by it. Before when the plague was announced to the Egyptians, the terms that they used was from Pharaoh all the way down to the servants. But in this when it actually takes place here, the emphasis is it goes down from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon. So anyone who was not partaking of the Passover, all the way down to the prisoners, all the way down to the lowlies of the lows, their firstborn was even taken from them. And it kind of gives more bigger emphasis and how much God really meant what he meant to do. There's no exceptions and there's no excuses for anybody who did not partake. And then the next verse is verse Moses and Aaron, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go serve the Lord as you have said. So I know that the last class we had, Megan was speaking about how this prophecy happened, and then previously Pharaoh said that you'll never see my face again after this moment, and if you do, you're going to die. And obviously this is a prophecy of kind of a prophecy, but what Pharaoh got wrong was basically Pharaoh got wrong was basically it wasn't Moses or Aaron that was going to die, it's him or somebody in his family that died. And that was kind of interesting because now Pharaoh is so distraught and in fear of Yahweh that he wants nothing to do with Israel, so he has to have no choice to summon Aaron and Moses once again in order for for God to stop stop the last mighty act. The last trace of basically it's to the point where Pharaoh is so bothered by this, he doesn't even want the last trace of the Israelites to be there. He wants it all to be eliminated from Egypt. And it's kind of like, if you think about it, it's like almost like a cancer. When you cut it off, you don't want any cancerous cells to remain, because anything left behind, it might regrow. And it kind of think about like the people of the Israelites in Egypt. At this point, they're so disturbed, they're so shocked and angry, and they're so in fear that they just anything and everything to do with the Israelites, they just get out of here, because they don't want to take this anymore. They don't want to be they don't want any more repercussions from the situation that they brought up about themselves. And in verse 32, why did Pharaoh say, "Bless me also"? And what does he mean by that? So, I mean, at this point, you know, I kind of interpret it. Durham didn't really say too much about this, but I kind of interpret it as bless me also, but in the sense that, you know, bless me by leaving completely. Just get out of here, because that's a blessing to me that you're gone, because you guys are just basically, you know, tearing Egypt apart. If you could turn to the next slide, Professor. The Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, "We shall all be dead." So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls being bound up in their cloaks on their shoulders. So verse 33, the Egyptians urged the departure of the Israelites. Durham states that they make stronger urge because they feared for their death. When the other plagues happened, they also urged that Pharaoh should let them leave, but Pharaoh didn't hear because the death and loss wasn't near and dear to him yet, especially his firstborn, who is his heir. And basically, this could be the end of his dynasty if he didn't get rid of the Israelite people, because we know that back in the day, the culture is the firstborn is usually your heir, and they take over. And obviously, at this point in time, Pharaoh's, and if he didn't get rid of all of the Israelites, he didn't let them go, then, you know, in the the process of the mind would think that, well, if I still won't let them go, will God take the rest of my children or the next people, and from there on, will that be the end of my dynasty? Um, and I kind of think back to Joseph, you know, when earlier when in the text said that these pharaohs didn't know of Joseph. It kind of, you know, basically, yeah, and that's why they don't respect their God. And these other people and the pharaohs before them, you know, they didn't respect him. And but in the situation where this pharaoh's father, uh, well, when Moses was born, you know, that person was in such in fear of the Israelites rising and revolting. He got rid of the firstborn children, and this is kind of like just bringing it back on reverse part of it. God, you know, we know that's a different situation, but God plays it differently. But verse 34 stood out to me. Emphasis on the unleavened bread that we were discussing earlier. Yahweh tells the Israelites about the rules of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This verse points out why they eat unleavened bread, because they were rushed out so hastily that they didn't have time for their breads to leaven, and they just took whatever the dough they had, and they took their kneading bowls and they just kind of left in a rush. And since they didn't have the time, and so for going from there on, you know, on their during their exodus, all they had to eat was these bread that it was not set long enough to leaven, and they could only cook these bread. And it's kind of important because at this point, you, for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that's the big remembering point that Jesus, oh, I mean not Jesus, but God, Yahweh, allowed them to, you know, make their exodus because of His mighty hand. And it's kind of like one of those, it's like a memento, I guess, where you could relive it over and over again by eating this bread. And every time you eat of this bread, you remember this experience that Yahweh has set you free. Turn to the next slide, Professor. So the people of Israel had also done as Moses told them, for they had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight, have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. In the ESV, they use the term plundered, making you think that, you know, the Israelites are kind of like pirates. But because God has shown himself through this 10th mighty act, the Israelites got to experience God's triumph over Pharaoh. And people were um, so fearful of the Israelites that whatever they wanted, any silver, jewels, or anything like that, they just basically kind of like, just like Moses told them they could, just go ask for it and they will give it to you. Because at this point, like we heard earlier, they were urging Pharaoh to let everyone leave, and in order for them to get rid of these people, they're like, we'll do whatever it takes. You could, if you ask for money, yeah, sure, just take my money and leave. I don't want you guys here. Just go. You've taken so much from us already. You've taken the firstborn of our families. And at this point, I kind of get the feeling it's more like a sense of fear, a fear of Yahweh, and this in the fact that he was able to do such a terrible act. Egyptians just, said no matter what they want or they need, just give it to them, let them go. It's very, I at this point it's kind of like just feeling like you pay any cost just to get to feel a sense of safety again. Can you change the next slide, please? And the people of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. A mixed multitude also went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough that they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not wait, nor they prepared any provisions for themselves. And once again, you get back to the answering of the question, why unleavened bread? I mean, because they were rushed out. Some interesting things I noticed was from Ramesses to Succoth. So Ramesses was the city where they were at, and to Succoth, it was about 35 to 40 kilometers, approximately 21 miles to 34 miles of a distance. And literally, these people are going, and it says here about 600,000 men on foot. I know that, and I looked it up in Logos, and it said that there's, the Bible only gives this number as a number of people that left, but then again, it also says women and children. And in most of the times, and back in the day, we all know that people had multiple kids, and it's not just one or two children. They had a handful, and we know from Jacob and everyone else, a lot of people had a lot more people, they had like 12 kids. But just saying that in general, say approximately, if we take the number of 4 people per household, and if there's a wife and 3 kids, or wife and 4 kids, this number could move up to into the 2 millions of people leaving. And we also know that it's a mixed multitude of people that went with them. So that's saying Egyptians and other slaves and other people left with the Israelites during this Exodus, and that that could push the numbers up to even almost 4 million people. And 4 million people with their herds and cattle and flock and everything like that, and they're traveling together for about 35 miles. And that's like a great distance, and on foot. And now you're saying possibly 2 to 4 million people in this march out of Ramesses. It's kind of like a unfathomable thought of or sight that you're about to see. Talk about Edomites. Yeah, so it's yeah, and it's gonna take a long time. And we all know that eventually Pharaoh puts on a chase after these people, and it's crazy to think that this is the amount of people that's gonna cross the Red Sea later on with Moses. And it's like, how did God even allow this or make this possible? And it's very awing to see the wonderful powers of our Lord and Savior, our Father. So if we could turn to the next slide. So here's the map. The first dot where the lines, a red line starts, and down to if you go bottom, start going towards the bottom right, the 2 dots away, that's Sakath, and that's about the great distance. That's the distance that they're walking. And I was able to use the scale to determine an approximate distance from Logos. And this is just a close-up screenshot of it, so you guys could get more of like, so you guys could see that there's they also cross they also journey past Pithom and a few other places as well. If you could turn to the next slide, please, Professor. So, and the people of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 men. So I guess I already pointed out this point. 2 million plus people left Egypt. It could have came up to about 4 million, give or take, depending on how large the family size is, and a mixed multitude of people that went along as well. Next slide, please, Professor. So verse 40, the time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. Like back to what the other statement I said earlier, no wonder, I'm not surprising that no one would remember Joseph. Pharaohs wouldn't even have known of Joseph in 430 years that passed. Who would remember Canaan? Who would remember to even want to return to back to where they went? That's back to the question that we were at. Professor Eschelbach was asking earlier. Why didn't they just leave earlier? In the beginning, 430 years have passed. So the Israelites of this point, that is part of the Exodus, most of them don't even know, of the land of Canaan where they came from, and most of these people won't even know of Joseph and all what he did for the Egyptians and for the Israelites when he was, basically second in command. So yeah, I mean, it's not a surprising thing for that to happen. And for 430 years, a lot of times people would lose their identity. So the Israelites wouldn't even know of, that they're Israelites. It's kind of just like basically almost becoming like, I'm pretty sure a lot of people could have been started to be a melting pot where, a lot of Jews married Egyptians or vice versa. And so that's an interesting thing. And then that's probably what you could also consist of, the mixed multitude that walked away, that left in the Exodus as well, because a lot of people married into different families, and a lot of people intermixed their families. And so yeah, well, Clarence question statement of the circumcision would separate them, but yeah, eventually you could move on, and there's an answer to that as well. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It was a night of watching by the Lord to bring them out of the land of Egypt. So this same night is a night of watching kept to the Lord by all the people of Israel throughout their generations. The first time I read this, I was like really confused what it really meant. Like, so this was the night that God was watching, and people, it was really confusing. So Durham states that God was watching for this day to keep his promise to deliver his people. And this was a belief held by the Hebrews, or the Jews, for generations. Makes me think of the Messiah. The Jews didn't doubt Moses for a moment, but they doubt Jesus as a Messiah. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, obviously they did doubt Moses a few times when he first came, and when Pharaoh tacked on more laborers for them, they doubted that God's work, and they kind of just like, let us go, and I don't want to deal with this. But it kind of goes back. But you also think about that this was a promise that made to them, and God keeps his promises. And who I'm pretty sure that just trying to emphasize the point that God, Yahweh, was keeping his promise to his people, and it might have taken 430 years for them to, be taken away out of Egypt, and then another 40 years of wandering before they got their land of promise. But there were people watching, and there were still, God was keeping his eye on it, and it was when God felt it was the right moment for him to do so, and he found the right instrument in Moses for him to do so. And obviously, we know that the fact that Moses was chosen was very interesting, because obviously his upbringing was a unique situation where he was a Hebrew adopted by the Egyptians, and then he later on left for so many years, and now he's 90 years old and he's back here. And another thing where he has a stutter, where he doesn't speak well, but God, to exemplify and magnify God's power and might, he uses Moses, even though his background and his disabilities and whatnot, just in order for God to make a statement and say, I'm keeping my promise, and this is how I'm keeping my promise. And I think that's very awesome, and it stands out to me, especially when I'm able to read this and it's broken down, and thanks to Durham and his translation as well, it made it easier to understand. If you could turn to the next slide. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the statute of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat of it, but every slave that is bought for money may eat of it after you have circumcised him. No foreigner or hired worker may eat of it. It shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the flesh outside the house, and you shall not break any of its bones. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it. So this is basically the rules of the Passover that was passed on to Moses through Yahweh. Why can't foreigners eat of the Passover? Durham states that the criteria is circumcision to join the covenant faith, and so that's back to what Clarence was mentioning. The circumcision will separate the foreigners from the people. So this would, obviously, yeah. Reading Clarence's comment, and it would definitely deter a lot of people from joining. But and another reason why you wouldn't want to have foreigners join unless they came into faith through circumcision was the Passover is an experience of God's people and suffering and emancipation. A foreigner can't draw back to the ancestral sufferings and memory and history of that situation back in that the Hebrews experienced. But it also says here, a purchased slave can eat after circumcision. My thought on that was they're owned by Yahweh's people, and the fact that they are slaves mean they will share in the religious practices of Yahweh's people. Not to mention that they are slaves, like how the Israelites were slaved. And so, most likely in those situations where these slaves are bought, they're going to get circumcised because that's a practice of the Hebrew people, and they're going to be serving the Hebrew people, and they're going to be working, and they're going to be so that's why they would come into faith, come into that shared faith of their owners. But like I said, my last comment was not to mention they were slaves just like the Israelites were. And so they get a sense of an experience of servitude and slave being under someone else's as well. But then again, through their faith in Yahweh, they could probably most likely be able to experience the wonders and the wonders and the mercy of God in their faith. And if you could turn to the next slide. So verse 48. If a stranger shall sojourn with you and would keep the Passover to the Lord, be circumcised, then he may come near and keep it. So obviously this is kind of like a slave situation as well, where these people who are traveling along with the Hebrew people, and if they come to faith and they accept to be circumcised, they're living day in and day out with the Hebrew people, and eventually they're gonna come to share the same faith. And once that happens, if they do really have the faith, then they're gonna accept circumcision, and they're gonna become part of the tribe. And this also addresses the situation where prior to the Exodus, some people might have married into non-Jewish families, and their parents and their in-laws probably would have went on the Exodus with the Hebrew people, and eventually, after witnessing the wonder, the hand of God in the 10th plague and everything like that, it's not surprising that they would come to faith and share the same practices eventually, because they've experienced, what God does for His people, and why not where you could, be protected and saved and taken care of. And if you're already married with a Jew, eventually that's it's kind of a no-brainer situation. Obviously, like Clarence said earlier, that circumcision thing is kind of like a taboo, but I mean, if you really believe, right, you probably would do it eventually anyways. Yeah, and other conquered people that were brought to Egypt as slaves as well. Yep. Um, so all the people of Israel did just as the Lord commanded, and Moses and Aaron. And on that very day, the Lord brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their host. That is pretty much what I have. Any questions or any comments or something you guys want to elaborate on? Because I know I didn't get. This is my overview. I kind of came about this from a perspective of a person asking questions during a Bible study, and this kind of the things that stood out.
Tim Norton, please.
Sorry, it took a second for the audio to come up. So Ben, you had back there at 12. Why did Pharaoh say, "Bless me"? That was one of your questions you had.
Yeah, that's one of the questions I had. I looked around for trying to find an answer.
Here's my thought, and I might be totally wrong. So the professor can correct me if I am. But I'm thinking this is a parallel kind of to the rich man. I mean, that's a parable, right? It's not an actual event, but the rich man and Lazarus, and the rich man's in hell, and he says, dip your finger in the water and cool my tongue, because I'm really suffering down here. So it's not really like saying, bless me because I believe in the Lord and He's so wonderful. It's boy, relieve me. This is just awful. And Durham did, the one comment that Durham did have about that was like, Pharaoh's finally admitting defeat. He's finally not arrogant and finally saying, okay, you got me.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, that's kind of my thought when I was reading that of this situation, relieving my family, my dynasty from from a possible end.
If I can,
sure, please.
Yeah, thanks, Timothy and Joseph, for your answer. First of all, I just wanted to note, because Timothy made reference to the Lazarus and the rich man, and it's not a parable, so that's just an important sideline, that all of the features of Lazarus and the rich man indicate historical narrative as opposed to parable, but you made a great reference to it as a parallel, in as much as the rich man just refuses to come up to speed with what's happened, and so still thinking of and treating Lazarus like a poor person who should serve him, and thinking about relief. But here's an important note, is that the rich man asks for relief, not for blessing. So I did check in the Hebrew text. Pharaoh asks Moses to bless him, barach, the same word that's used consistently through the Old Testament. God blessed creation, and He blessed Adam and Eve. It said, "Be fruitful and multiply," and that sort of a thing. So still, whether it's actually a moment of honesty and capitulation, an admission of submission, admission of submission from Pharaoh to Yahweh, the true God, or whether Pharaoh's still just being an opportunist and say, well, okay, so I can't win this war, but I could at least get a little something out of it, a blessing. This word for bless always means to become what God intends you to be. And so either way, Pharaoh has something to gain by seeking the blessing of the Lord. Clarence.
Oh, there it is. All right. Yeah, the Lutheran Study Bible references, and I was wondering what you thought about that, where he says the Pharaoh didn't still want them to go. He's referencing back to 10:25 through 26, that, yeah, take your livestock, and because he doesn't know what the Lord's going to require them for sacrificing. But it seems like the reference here is saying that the Pharaohs only let them go to do their sacrificial service to the Lord. And so he still is saying that he still wants to hold on to the Lord. So I thought, is a Lutheran looking at it differently than Durham, or
Joseph?
you understand?
Sorry, you kind of broke off halfway through your question, so I didn't hear you clearly. I'm thinking that you were saying that for verse 25 to 26, that it kind of just sounded like the other times where Pharaoh said, "Oh, just you guys could leave with your livestock and everything like that." Kind of like the previous times where he still wants to keep them around, but he's just letting them go for their sacrifice. I kind of think that if that's what you're saying, I think that it's actually no, it's kind of different, because this is as a result of the 10th mighty plague, or the 10th mighty act. And at this point, Pharaoh just wants to get rid of them, because he said, he doesn't want them there anymore, because
Yeah, I understand. Well, I understand that, but here it's saying that the Pharaoh, and this is the quote, Pharaoh is not granting total independence, but the requested time for a festival from 10:25 through 26. And that's the Lutheran Study Bible. So I'm wondering why, yeah, that's a total different perception than that. So I'm kind of confused on that. It seems more in line with the Pharaoh to want to keep control. So that's why I would probably favor this interpretation from the Lutheran Study Bible. Go ahead.
yeah, I mean, I favor that too. I think that I kind of read that earlier, and I kind of brushed it off, because I from what my perspective is after the result of the 10th plague, but I also see his side, because eventually we know that he chases after them, because if what Durham says is kind of it kind of validate why
Yeah, then
he
that would be
changed his mind later on and comes back and chases after them, because they didn't return after his little after he agreed for them to go on their little sabbatical to make the offering and worship of God.
If I can jump in, two things. One is this may be similar to when the Philistines captured the ark, and then of course their god Dagon kept falling face down on the ground, and then there were rats came, and then there were tumors, boils on the people, and so they had to get some help to figure out how to get rid of this ark again, not wanting it in the midst of them because they didn't know what to do with its power or how to be blessed by it rather than cursed. So if that reference is any help, it would give us some insight into what Clarence is working on. But that would be a very interesting study to pursue. Since we're at a little bit over time, but let's hear from two more questions, Molina and then Lucas. Molina, please.
I guess for me, the same concept in terms of the blasphemy idea. I was just thinking, maybe does that mean, like, Pharaoh was asking, when we pleading for the last act to stop? I mean, we heard about it on Exodus 8 that he asked Moses to pray for him, which Moses actually responded back. It's interesting here, he did not. I mean, I read through a lot of text, but it's not response back from Moses. And for me, what it sounded was, is he really asking? Because right now he lost his firstborn. He lost every firstborn, anything that he can think of, and he know Moses have access to greater power, God Yahweh. Is he asking for the plagues or the acts of God to stop when he said, "Bless me"? I think that was just a question for Joseph.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of came to that conclusion as well, because it uh, at that point is that's why I asked the question, bless him, where he asked to be blessed, and I kind of took that. I read multiple versions, and all of them said bless, and then obviously Professor Eschelbach gave us the Hebrew text as well, and it also says bless, and it's the same kind of bless that was used repeatedly. And so at this point, for me, when I read it, I kind of just felt that any relief is a blessing because of that situation, and the fact that all the firstborn sons were killed in this act. My thought, obviously, please bless me by no longer allowing any of this to happen anymore going on. It's I kind of feel more like it's more of a fearful fearful reply. But then again, from what Professor Eschelbach said earlier, where it could just be like him kind of playing it off still, like, oh yeah, okay, so you guys did this to us now, and so just ask your Lord to bless me, and yeah, you guys could leave. And so it's really hard to understand or interpret, especially when we weren't the people there, and we're just reading from what we understood, and from our cognitive understanding of today, what that might mean is, I don't know, it's really hard for me to answer. But I do like what you said, and I do kind of agree that that is a possibility.
Okay, and I also thought of when Esau, after he sold his birthright and found out that Jacob had, as he calls it, stolen his blessing, and then he pleads with Isaac to bless him also. But it's always wonderful and interesting to hear these different ideas and insights, and it gives us a good motivation to use a concordance to good advantage. So if you pursued all of the occurrences of the word barak as bless in the Old Testament, and see if there are times when someone wants a blessing just in terms of relief. I can't think of any, but I haven't looked for every instance. So that would be interesting and worth pursuing when someone had the chance. Okay, Lucas.
I apologize if this was already said, but we have Jacob who wanted a blessing from God when he wrestled him, and he wouldn't let God go. Maybe he did want relief there because his hip was hurting a lot. But we have a parallel with Pharaoh, who wanted a blessing and wouldn't let his people go. Jacob's stem from faith, Pharaoh's stem from pride and arrogance. And I don't know that was said, but Joseph, what do you think about that connection or parallel? One had pure motives for blessing to hold on to something, and one had impure motives to hold on to something.
I like your comparison, and but the thing that gets to me when you said that was, they're coming from two different perspectives. One is truly, wanting a gift, a wonderful gift from God, and the other person is just basically saying, I'm tapping out, and just leave me, and but obviously I know your God has power, so kind of just bless me in the same, in this, just bless me because I kind of need it right now. I kind of feel like Jacob, when he's wrestling with God and trying to get the blessing, is because he earnestly has faith, and he's really wanting, to be, to receive something from God that, that creates a wonderful relationship with God, versus Pharaoh, who's just trying to. It sounds like Pharaoh's just trying to, get some good out of all this blight that he's experienced.
Okay, so good, Lucas. A great observation of a parallel. Another one, and a use of a concordance would bring us to that one too. Joseph, thanks for hanging in there. And so, between Lucas is sort of the Lucan approach to trying to see the positive, and Luther did that at times. It's interesting, Luther actually defended Sarah when she laughed, as she laughed in faith. And then Joseph, more skeptical about the Pharaoh, and less having to do with faith. But you could make that argument with Jacob as he wrestled with God too. Why is he wrestling with him at all instead of just being compliant? So everybody, well done. Joseph, thank you. And we'll come back in 10 minutes, so 7 minutes after the hour. Again, thank you, everyone. All right, welcome back, everyone. Before we get into our second run of the text, just some notes. So Thursday, Lucas will be our presenter, and then next week, Monday, it will be um, Luis Morales, and I have a conflict at 7:20, and so rather than meeting from 6 to 8 p.m. next Monday, we'll be meeting from 5 to 7 p.m. So yes, and I'll remind us all about that on Thursday again, and it's recorded also. So if it's a conflict for someone else at from 5 to 6, that's all right. It'll be recorded, and you can give that a look when you get the chance. I'm noticing too on quiz scores, I'm missing some quiz scores from some of you. So I put quiz 1 and 2 back up there until I think Monday. You're getting the hang of it now with quizzes 3 and 4, but I just wanted to note from now on, if you don't get a response from me, when you send me your quiz score, that means I don't have it. And so I'll be very diligent from now on. When you send me a quiz score by way of email, I'll just hit reply and just something short like okay or yes or good or something just to acknowledge that I have your score. And then you know that I have it. And then just overall, a review of the presentations we've had so far, really, really good quality. I appreciated Joseph had an overview to start with. He had text and he read the text. He did some work on a particular word. He had good references to Durham and other resources like the Lutheran Study Bible. He raised good questions and oftentimes took a shot at an answer. Also used a logos. And that calendar image was really helpful and interesting visual and resource, a reference to a movie, and that you can use with good effect when you're teaching. So far, Joseph was speaking the most quickly, and I'm afraid that's my fault because I'm the one that's guilty of that all the time. So Brian and Baron and Megan, I was really impressed and enjoyed their pace, although Baron went way over. I forgot about that till just now. But the long and the short of it is to try and find that happy medium between conveying as much information as we can because it's so interesting and important, and taking a pace that's encouraging to the people and doesn't make us frantic. I'm not accusing you of that, Joseph, but I'm aware of that in my own work. My wife accuses me of it all the time, and I'm penitent. But then also, uh, well, I guess that's it. Okay. Also, just a kind of a byproduct of this, um, if you guys didn't already think of this, this course is giving you a nice kind of a 17-week or more study for Exodus if you wanted to use that in your ministry sooner or later. And if you wanted to take some of the tangents that we could, following words or concepts through the Bible and especially into the New Testament, you could get probably a whole school year. You know, if you take the summers off or do something different over the summers, you could get a nice year's study out of this Exodus. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's take a look at a few things. Clarence raised, or Joseph raised some questions that I think we'll come back to because I was interested in them as well. And so starting with a little bit this time, trying not to go so fast, just look at some big pieces of this puzzle that Joseph took us through so nicely. And so back to 12:16 again, this mention of an assembly. It's a kahal in Hebrew. In the New Testament, we have terms referring to the place where they met. So the synagogue, that's Greek, to gather together or to lead together. The ecclesia, commonly translated church, which is those who are called out So that's very much like this sanctified idea. So the Holy Assembly would be very much analogous to a gathering of those who are called out, meaning believers. And then the liturgia, the Greek word for service, it's any kind of service, especially public service, but then it was used by the early Christians to describe their gathering together to celebrate the Lord's Supper. So it's interesting, the question of the Seventh-day Adventists that Joseph raised, because of two things. One is, we do know the sequence of the days of the week from Jewish practice. So it'd be hard to imagine that somehow in the history of Jewish observance of the Sabbath, the day had been moved from Sunday back to Saturday, or from Friday to Saturday, or something else like that. So we have every reason to accept that Saturday was the last day of the first 7 days ever, and that's the day that God rested. So from evening on Friday until evening, the end of the day Saturday, that was the Sabbath. Why Christian observance moved to Sunday was a feature of the resurrection. And so on that first day of the week, and so there's lots of discussion both in the New Testament and in early church fathers about recreation, or the eighth day being the first day of the recreation or regeneration. And so that's what the Christian church was celebrating. That's also when Jesus breaks bread then with his apostles, and their eyes were open in the breaking of the bread, so references to communion and communing with them again. Also interesting, just if you had a conversation with the Adventists, is that it's work to worship. It's certainly work for those who are leading worship and those who are preparing for and providing for worship. And so it's hardly a Sabbath, certainly not in my experience. So happily, as a parish pastor, you kind of could take it easy on Saturday actually and rest, and then go to work and work real hard for most or all of Sunday. Now, so no work shall be done. So my question about are we still obliged to do this holy assembly or keep the Sabbath on Saturday? And are we getting this right? And that's a question that Joseph raised, and you'll find the answers in the New Testament. And one of the principles of that answer is that the freedom that the gospel brings, and that's sort of supported by how little Jesus actually says about Christian observances in the New Testament. You're free to observe as much as you like, and you're not bound to observe anything just because someone else thought it was a good idea. But Acts 2:42 kind of really encapsulates the New Testament Christian pattern, which is they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine. So that's a 24/7 kind of thing. In the fellowship, that's a communion of believing people as they interact with each other and support each other. The breaking of bread, so the Lord's Supper, which would have been celebrated on Sundays typically, but not exclusively, and the prayers. And then just a thought about the law here too, concerning laws that God gives. So just reminding us about the difference between the moral law, 10 Commandments, the ceremonial law, and the civil law. And especially in regard to the ceremonial law, Jesus has some very refreshing clarifications about those kinds of laws. So in regard to the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And then on more than one occasion, when the religious establishment of Jesus' day tries to find fault with him for healing and doing good on the Sabbath, and then he raises questions for them about common practices even among the Levites on the Sabbath in the Old Testament, and there's no guilt involved with it. So it's very refreshing to see the ideals and the principles behind the law and the different kinds of law that God gives, just the common sense approach and why God gives the law and how it's supposed to benefit us rather than being a burden, or just some kind of superficial observance with no importance or benefit for us. Okay. It didn't. This. Yeah. This sometimes happens, and I forgot. So up here where you see these three weirdo triangle, arrow, and another triangle, those were Hebrew letters. And so if you ever, just by the way, in PowerPoint, if you're ever going to use Greek or Hebrew text, you actually have to take a screenshot of it and insert it into your slides. Otherwise, PowerPoint, for some reason, changes it into this symbol font, and I forgot. So anyway, zakar in Hebrew, translated remember, and we talked a little bit earlier in the semester about what it means when God remembers, that he always takes action accordingly, and so with God, remembering or providing a way to remember is potent. So think first of God remembering, and so he acts, and then you think of the Passover as a memorial, and there was some nice conversation in the chat boxes about that. And then you think about Jesus in his institution of the Lord's Supper, saying, "This do often in remembrance of me," that there's a potency to that memory tool. In other words, his very body and blood coming forward in time and space with his word to convey the forgiveness of sins, life, and salvation, and so forth. So there was a comment earlier about this. Well, I'll get to the forever part in just a minute. So you shall observe this day throughout your generations. And then just thinking a minute about the benefit of remembering emancipation. So our country has the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and if you haven't been there to see that and the changing of the guards, it's worth seeing. And the value of paying close attention to both the cost of your liberation and the challenges of maintaining it. Now, I was just wondering, when we gather for a sacred assembly, why not, if we're interested in remembering things, meet at a water park, for example, if we wanted to remember lots of things that happened by water, the ark and Noah and the crossing through the Red Sea and the crossing through the Jordan and Naaman's cleansing and that whole host of fantastic things that revolve around water in the Bible, both Testaments. Or similarly, it wouldn't have to be a French restaurant, of course, but the French do come to mind when we think of bread and wine. And I'm not suggesting that we shift locations of our worship services to water parks or restaurants, but just wondering if we can pull along with us a consciousness of the biblical history and narrative, which is our own, when we are swimming or when we are breaking bread and having wine. And maybe this is just sort of an encouragement or an application, because we want to keep our eye on applying the lessons that we learn. When we think of Zakar, and when we think of the elements that God has used in history involved in the liberation of his people, let's say a family or a church group, goes to a water park. Could we gather kind of off to the side just a moment before we all dive in and splash around and just ask people, hey, who remembers something that happened with water in the Bible? And just think it through for a little while. Or, if we were hosting a little gathering, or even if, family celebration at a restaurant, and hey, let's order some wine first, or serve wine and some bread as appetizer. And hey, let's think a minute, folks, about the nature of the body of Jesus, and how it is the living bread that came down from heaven, the bread that gives life, and his blood that animated his human nature to do all that was required to redeem us as our substitute. Just that kind of thing. So drawing with us day by day and throughout the day, when you're in the shower, when you're washing your hands, um, all kinds of times like that. I think, which is more akin to what God has in mind when he thinks about remembering. So not just concentrated in a Sunday morning for an hour, but all week long. Okay, and rightly so, Joseph kept returning to this significance of leaven, and what is it all the time with the leaven, or unleavened in this case. And so a note here, so like the Sabbath, according to the New Testament, are we missing the point with how often and what leaven to put out of our lives? So here again, the use of a concordance, logos, if that serves you well, or if you want to make sure you're getting to the original words behind your English translation, you can use Young's. It will take you to places that will give you all kinds of great biblical, let the Bible speak to the question to good effect. And so two things that you'll find at least about leaven or unleavened. One was this idea of leaving in haste. And so that kind of connects us with the many times that Jesus, when he talks about the end times or the coming times from the first century perspective, always being ready, being watchful, being ready to move quickly when you see the signs of the times and the need to be prepared for the end. Certainly we are in the end times, and not just in terms of moving quickly as the final Exodus, because I don't think there's any missing that for us, but maybe more in terms of being quick or being ready to move or act quickly when an opportunity presents itself to help someone else in an Exodus. To be watchful for that. So I see that in my classroom all the time, any given day, any given part, even during a class period, I see students connect and lights come on. Once in River Forest, I was teaching New Testament, and we were in Romans, and I had just explained what Paul meant. I think we were in Romans 4 about how the gospel works, and it was just fascinating that a young lady raised her hand. She was Hispanic and Roman Catholic, and she said it like this: "Do you mean to tell me, or did I just hear you say that God has already saved us without us ever having done anything, and accomplished all of that in Jesus Christ? And not only that, but he does all of the rest of what it takes to save us all the way until we are in everlasting life with him." And I said, that's exactly what I meant to say, and that's what Paul's saying in Romans. And lots of examples of that. A neighbor that just came to services with us on Sunday morning that my wife's been noticing and responding to her hunger and thirst for the truth and for grace and that sort of thing. So that's the ready to move, remembering that we're strangers and sojourners, and there was more of that coming. And then the other half of it is this business of leaven puffing up. And so, for example, with the Corinthians, big surprise, with the Corinthian congregation, Paul addresses the need for them to get rid of the leaven, meaning pride, conceit, arrogance, hypocrisy, all of those sorts of egocentric problems of fallen human nature. And he says, so cleanse out that leaven. And he said, don't you know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? So back to that notion we looked at with Joseph too, about any little bit of cancer will come right back and make trouble. It's deadly. So again, unleavened because we're strangers and sojourners and ready to move. Not leaven, because leaven has to do with kind of the um, arrogance of human nature and boasting about things when it should be humble and penitent. And then Jesus' comment here, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And if you remember, the disciples began to ask each other because they hadn't brought any bread. And Jesus says, don't you understand what I'm talking about? And so there's Jesus' own kind of look back to the significance of leaven or unleavened in the Old Testament. Okay, this business of the blood in the Passover, and this has been well known and recognized through the history of Christianity, and certainly plenty of great sources for kind of unpacking the significance of this. Certainly in the ancient Christian commentary, those early church fathers and the time they spent to draw the significance out of this. So you're touching the lintel and the two doorposts of your house with the blood. And in the New Testament, we're reminded that your body is the temple or the house of the Holy Spirit that dwells in you. And then we think, of course, then of receiving the body and blood of Christ through our mouths in the Lord's Supper. And so the blood of the Lord is on the lintels of the home where our soul, regenerate soul, and the Holy Spirit lives, and so the Lord passes over us. And of course, because the blood of Christ cleanses us from all sins, we kind of live with the benefits of a permanent Passover, and that's a fantastic reality to contemplate. So in how many ways do we experience parallels to this but miss the realization of it? In other words, this just the idea, the physical experience of doorway and frame of the door and passing through. You might remember also when he talks about the doorposts. Well, when we get to Deuteronomy 6, the Israelites were supposed to put the Ten Commandments on the doorposts of their houses. And then if you remembered this practice then, so the Ten Commandments on the entrance and exit of my home exposes my failure and so guilt, but the blood that's innocent covers that. So something else about the blood, it comes from a lamb, and so it's evidence or looking at a sign of an innocent life, because the lamb was a living being, and so the life is innocent, and that looking forward to the Lamb of God, so the incarnate Son of God, who is completely, perfectly innocent in his life. And yeah, good. Jesus is the door. Yeah, in his life, and so his life instead of ours, and as a covering for ours. By way of movie reference, just a really powerful, fantastic moment towards the end of Shawshank Redemption when he comes having crawled through the sewer, which is really illustrative of the experience he had from the time he was arrested wrongfully and tried and then incarcerated, and what he endured during the time of his imprisonment, both by way of humiliation from fellow prisoners and humiliation by the warden. And then, so I think you could make a case that crawling through that sewer was better, a better experience. You'd choose that any day from continuing to live with the mistreatment of his fellow prisoners and the warden. But then really the climax, he comes out and it's raining, and so he stands and he looks up to heaven and he's just being cleansed by the rain as he experiences freedom again for the first time in such a long time. What a fantastic image and a visual footage of action of God's redemption of our lives in baptism and so forth. I was just thinking back how often with the kids They just love to do this, to just start moving furniture around from the dining room and living room and grab some blankets and pillows and make this big, long um, tabernacle in the living room and crawl under there and pretend you're camping and go get some things, some provisions and so forth. Another simple but powerful way, underneath that blanket, that tent made of blankets and things, to talk about or even read, from a child's garden of Bible stories, another Bible story book, the Exodus narrative and things about the tabernacle, and just kind of live that history. So again, carrying this Old Testament history and narrative forward with us. Also, how to keep the blood on the lintels of the door. So where we move in and out, for Israelites to have a sensory perception and then memory of what had happened, what God provided in the Passover. And so also now expanding not just from our mouth, but eyes, ears, nose, throat, hands, to keep our senses open to the significance of how God worked our redemption. So you can think about in the gospel narratives the different means that Jesus used on various occasions to heal. So often just speaking the word, but other times touching someone's ears or mouth or eyes, or making mud and put it on their eyes, and certainly often the sense of touch and Jesus touching someone to help. Again, what blood's all about in human physiology and all of God's creation is parabolic or paradigmatic in nature. And so blood not only carries energy that allows us to live and do and be on behalf of others, but it also carries away the toxins, the poisons in our system, so those can be eliminated. So certainly Jesus did both, and his word does both, and we're carrying that word with us to the nations. Then just to slow down again a minute, I often get this question from students, so why the sacraments? Especially if they've just read 1 Corinthians 2:14, the natural man receives not the things of the Spirit, neither can he, for they're spiritually discerned. So that actually is an answer to the question. So if we think about not being one-dimensional, but three-dimensional, and as regenerated believers, because of the word's activity in our souls, but still possessing a human nature, as Jesus says, that which is the flesh remains flesh, and Paul refers to that here. So our human nature always unbelieving, disbelieving, contrary, contradictory, and weak and doubtful. So does God provide for our soul an antidote for that doubt of our human nature? And I'm suggesting to you that's precisely what the sacraments are intended to do. So a physical element added with the promise and institution of God in our baptism constantly answers the question, do I have a regenerate soul? Is there a new person within me, regenerated, recreated in the image of Christ, that is being described all through the Bible in positive examples of faith and in profoundly positive language in 1 John when he says, those who are generated of God do not sin. In the Lord's Supper again now, not once in our life, but and not even just weekly, but often as we would, again, this meal, and God takes some care about who he invites to his table. So if you're at God's table, you're family. So that's reminding us of our birthright. And then to have this meal served to us by God himself, which is the very God who took on human flesh, who now is conveying the power of his whole person, all the Godhead in his person, dwelling as in a body, conveyed to us as often as we would seek it. I don't know of a pastor that ever said no when a person sought to confess and be absolved and then be communed. And then, of course, absolution, which is as available as our neighbor and as often as we would uh, seek the forgiveness of our sins. 2 more slides, and then I want to see what you guys have on your mind. So we did, this came up forever. You shall keep this right forever, and that's again where the original languages are helpful. So olam, a long, long time, and it did go on 1,400 years. It went on. That's a long time, and then of course it's not just terminated, this practice, but fulfilled. So the Passover was a prophetic ordinance, just as circumcision was from the very inception. And so it's great. If you haven't done it yet, do read that section in Luke 22 where the testaments change. Of the 4 Gospels, it's in Luke that I take time with the class to look at the institution of the Lord's Supper, because it includes this changeover narrative. If you want to get the whole of the Maundy, Thursday evening experience, then you go to John 13 through 17, which interestingly doesn't include the Lord's Supper narrative, but it's there. But you give this lots and lots of great discourse from Jesus surrounding the Lord's Supper. Okay, and then this business about who participates. 2 things about that. So it's obvious and evident that the whole family was included in the Passover. No one is actually even allowed to be excluded, and we can dismiss those sort of pesky, ridiculous questions about infants. So infants who were not yet consuming solids, they weren't eating lamb, and they didn't, they weren't drinking fluids from a cup or wine, certainly, or eating bitter herbs, but they were there and present, and by way of the mother, if they were nursing, then they were still, connected to this Passover celebration. So that on one level, so the whole family's included, and then the other side of it, which Joseph gave us some opportunity to think about here with this language of foreigner. And so we want to think about foreigner on 2 levels, and Jesus is punctuating this in the Gospels, and the day of Pentecost is repunctuating this fact that God is not looking at the superficial, but at the substantive. So you notice on the one hand it says no foreigner, no sojourner, no hired servant, but then here it sort of sounds contradictory, but it's not. A stranger, when a stranger sojourns with you and would keep the Passover, right, then he becomes circumcised and so forth. So there's one law for the native, so that would be a genetically born, physical descent child of Israel, and the stranger who sojourns among you. That very sojourning is evidence that here's a person who is akin to Abraham, who like Abraham sees him or herself as a stranger and sojourner. So there's 2 levels of foreigner then. Foreigner as not with Israel, which could include Israelites who were rebellious and contradictory and refused to participate or take this seriously. And then there was the foreigner who's not foreign to Israel, but a foreigner or sojourner, like properly speaking, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, according to Hebrews 11. So also give Hebrews 11 if you want to kind of remember how that works. And then, so the Passover, and then Israel's out. So notice I caught this also. Pharaoh's asking for this blessing and posed the question, is Pharaoh finally getting it, or is this just a monarch's perspective on being served? And I think we'll just leave that question for pursuit, because I think we need more research than we have done so far to actually be definitive about that. And then I was interested finally in this comment, we're all dead men, and we can certainly understand the terror of the Egyptians and not knowing, either not knowing or not remembering or not paying attention to the prophecy of the last plague, that it would be the firstborn. But, you know, unbelieving, contrary human nature is this pendulum swing. So first, we're not going to pay any attention to the threats that the plagues bring, and then we're going to think that we're all completely lost and there's no hope or future for us because of a plague. And if you again read the Gospels with this in mind, you'll see oftentimes people in the crowds doing this, but more often you'll see the apostles themselves on this pendulum swing. So on one occasion, the apostles will be arguing about who's the greatest, and then on the next occasion, Peter's sinking in the water, or they're arguing or fearful because they didn't bring bread, and that's right after Jesus fed the multitude. And that's just how human nature works, from pride to hopelessness, which is why it's so fantastic that Jesus in the boat calms the storm, responds to the fears. So God with us, Emmanuel, gives us that stability, and that stability, part of that stability is this soul of ours that the Holy Spirit inhabits, that brings such a great and lasting calm. So that's what I have for you tonight, and I'm glad we have a little time now. So if anyone has a question or a comment, let's hear. Yeah, Clarence, please.
We were taking last semester. We took pastoral counseling, and we brought this up about the idea of group PTSD, and how, you know, from generation to generation, like the Native Americans Tim and I work with, that this gets passed on. And so also, so the PTSD, and they found this with the Cambodians in Massachusetts, and in Hawaii with the 442nd 100th Battalion, the most wounded decorated unit in World War II, they had it. And the different ways they came through it as a group. And I'm wondering if this may have had a healing idea, this feast of remembering, because, you know, when we do Celebrate Recovery or other counseling stuff, we take them back in remembrance to the tragedy, to the event. And like the Jews, it's a great thing that they started celebrate. Most of their feasts are around those kind of ideas. So I'm wondering if in mind, this is not only just remember the glorious God, but this is a way for them to get through it, because they saw a lot of bad stuff.
Yeah,
and it must have affected them.
Yeah, thank you, Clarence. Could you tell, for the sake of the group and me, what PTSD, the acronym, what that stands for?
Post-traumatic syndrome.
Yeah. Okay. Right. I'm so grateful that you brought that up. A couple things to add. One of something that makes Christianity different than other world religions is that the physical elements and the activity that God gives are always substantive. They're always actually really communicating, and you sort of see the insight of the Creator knowing His creation. And you can, reflect on the book of Hebrews language about we don't have a high priest who's unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. And I'm thinking of two examples too that I know of. So a brother pastor in my circuit in Michigan who was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam, and every year since they've been back, they have an annual meeting. I think it's in Vegas maybe, but to this day, this year, those Vietnam veterans get together, and he'll talk about how they still relive experiences and cry about them, and just still working out the trauma and the grief and all the sorts of baggage that comes with that. And I also remember the Vietnam Wall, when the traveling wall. That came to the town my parish was in Michigan when I was there, and it was there for I think a week or two. And I had some Vietnam vets, and what they would tell me was, you would find people there all hours, day and night, in the middle of the night. There would be men out there just reliving, working through that sort of thing. So yes, and how much more powerful for us when we celebrate, the Lord's Supper. So this is the meal Jesus had, knowing what was coming next. And as I prepare for the next weeks when we get together, and we just hinted at it tonight about how do you maintain the freedom once you've been liberated, and a lot of that has to do with carrying forward with you the cost of the liberty that you enjoy. So thanks again, Clarence. Any other questions, comments, observations? Okay, well, class, I know you have another one coming up, and you could probably use 12 minutes and not just 10. But Lucas, on Thursday at 6 o'clock, and don't forget to post your observations in the next 24 hours, and don't forget to take the quiz somewhere in the 24 hours before Thursday at 6. God bless you in your studies and your other coursework and your ministry. Good night.
Hey, Professor, are we on for 5 and Thursday, just to double check?
No, Thursday's regular, everybody, 6 o'clock Thursday. It's next week, Monday, that's 5.
Okay, got you. Okay. And Professor, I can just email that
Dr.
to you
Eschenbach?
late morning, my presentation?
Yeah, sure. Yes, somebody asked something.
Yes, yeah. This is Tim Norton. I sent you a quiz on I think it was Friday, one of the ones I missed earlier, and then I sent you one today. Did you get them? Because I didn't get a response from you on either.
Yep, that was before I knew I needed to be in response mode. Yeah, I have all 4 of yours, Tim.
Oh, okay, great. I just wanted to make sure, since you said that thing about
Yep, that's the right
not
thing to
getting
do.
some of
You should check.
And Professor,
okay,
I
great.
think this is Lucas.
Have a
I
good
sent
evening.
all 4 as well.
Lucas. Actually, I don't, Lucas. The only score I have actually for you is quiz 1. So if you want to email me your scores for 2, 3, and 4, that would be great.
Okay. Is there a maybe what email? Again, I'll double check. Is it within a Blackboard email, or is it?
I tell you what,
I guess.
Lucas, I'll email you right now, and then you can just email me back your quiz scores, and then you'll know that you have my email correct.